The desert heat shimmered off the asphalt of Veterans Memorial Park in downtown Phoenix, Arizona, creating the kind of oppressive atmosphere that made everything feel heavier, more intense, more consequential. At 3:47 p.m. on Tuesday, September 15th, the temperature gauge at the nearby bank read 107 degrees Fahrenheit. But the real heat was about to come from something far more volatile than the Arizona sun. Staff Sergeant Darius Jackson, 32, stood at the bus stop across from the memorial, checking his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. He'd been making this pilgrimage every month for the past 8 months, ever since President Biden had placed the Medal of Honor around his neck in a ceremony at the White House that still felt like someone else's dream. Today marked exactly 13 months since the battle in Afghanistan's Kunar province that had changed everything. The battle that had cost him his best friend and earned him the highest military decoration the United States could bestow. The weight of the medal beneath his gray t-shirt was nothing compared to the weight of the memories it represented. Darius closed his eyes and felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the phantom pain from shrapnel wounds that had healed months ago, but somehow still ached when the ghosts got too loud. "Timothy Hayes, KIA, October 3rd, 2023, he whispered to himself, the words becoming a mantra he used to center himself before these visits. Michael Rodriguez, KIA, October 3rd, 2023, James Morrison, KIA, October 3rd, 2023. 3 names among thousands on the wall, but 3 names that echoed in his dreams every night. Across the street, Officer Jake Reynolds was beginning what should have been a routine patrol of the memorial grounds with his K-9 partner, Rex. At 28, Reynolds had 5 years of experience with the Phoenix Police Department and had been partnered with Rex for the past 18 months. The German Shepherd had come from a military working dog program transferred to civilian law enforcement after his original handler, Sergeant Maria Vasquez, had been killed by an IED in Mosul. What Reynolds didn't know, what the paperwork had failed to adequately convey, was that Rex carried his own invisible wounds, his own complicated relationship with loss and loyalty. Rex had been acting strange all morning. During their pre-shift inspection, the dog had been restless, whining softly and pacing in his kennel. Dr. Sarah Chen, the department's veterinary consultant, had examined him and found nothing physically wrong, but she'd noted in her report that former military working dogs sometimes experienced what could only be described as PTSD episodes, triggered by scents, sounds, or situations that reminded them of their combat service. "Easy, boy," Reynolds murmured as Rex pulled against his leash, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. Just another day at the park. But it wasn't just another day, and Rex seemed to know it. The Veterans Memorial in Phoenix was a masterpiece of bronze and granite, dedicated in 1995 and expanded twice since then as new conflicts added new names to remember. The centerpiece was a larger-than-life bronze statue of 3 soldiers, one from World War II, one from Vietnam, and one from the Gulf War, standing eternal watch over a curved granite wall etched with over 3,000 names of Arizona servicemen and women who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Darius had memorized the location of every name he'd come to honor. Timothy Hayes was in Section C, Panel 7, Line 23. Michael Rodriguez was 3 lines below him. James Morrison was on the adjacent panel. But Darius always started with Timothy, his battle buddy, his closest friend, the man who died in his arms while a medic helicopter struggled to reach their position through Taliban fire. The crosswalk signal turned green, and Darius began his slow journey across the street. His right leg, still bearing shrapnel that doctors had deemed too dangerous to remove, protested with each step. The combat boots he wore, the same ones that had carried him through 3 deployments, had been resoled twice but never replaced. They were part of his ritual, his connection to the soldier he'd been before the world had labeled him a hero. Officer Reynolds noticed the man approaching the memorial and felt Rex tense beside him. The German Shepherd's ears perked forward, his body language shifting from casual patrol alertness to something more focused, more intense. "What is it, boy?" Reynolds asked, following the dog's gaze to the black man in civilian clothes walking with a slight limp toward the memorial wall. In Reynolds's mind, warning flags began to rise. The man's military bearing was unmistakable, the straight posture despite the limp, the way his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings, the purposeful stride that spoke of tactical training. But Reynolds had been conditioned by 5 years of police work to see threats first, to ask questions later. A black man in civilian clothes moving with military precision toward a public monument, his training told him to be suspicious. The crowd that had been sparse moments before began to thicken as people noticed the commotion. Emily Carter, a 34-year-old reporter for Channel 12 News, had been at the memorial interviewing visitors for a Veterans Day feature story when the confrontation began. Her cameraman, David Kim, immediately began recording as Emily recognized the potential for a significant news story. "David, are you getting this?" she whispered urgently. "Police confrontation at a veterans memorial. This could be huge." Jake Morrison, 41, a construction worker taking his lunch break in the park, looked up from his sandwich as Rex's barking intensified. Morrison was a Navy veteran himself, having served 2 deployments aboard the USS Ronald Reagan, and something about the scene unfolding before him triggered his own protective instincts. "What the hell?" Morrison muttered, setting down his lunch and moving closer to get a better view of what was happening. Christina Park, 29, a social worker who specialized in veteran services and PTSD counseling, was jogging through the memorial park when she heard the disturbance. Her professional training kicked in immediately as she assessed the situation. A black man being confronted by police at a veterans memorial, the potential for racial profiling, the likelihood that the situation could escalate quickly and dangerously. She pulled out her phone and began recording, her social work instincts telling her that documentation might be crucial for whatever legal or administrative proceedings might follow. Dr. Amanda Foster, 52, a physician who ran a free clinic for veterans dealing with service-related injuries and trauma, had been visiting the memorial as part of her monthly ritual of honoring colleagues she'd lost during her own service as an Army medic. She noticed the confrontation developing and immediately recognized the signs of potential trouble. "This doesn't look right," she murmured to herself, moving closer while keeping her phone ready to call for medical assistance if the situation deteriorated. Captain David Hayes, retired Army, 67 years old, had been approaching his monthly visit to his son Timothy's name on the memorial wall when he noticed the crowd gathering around a black man being confronted by police. Something about the man's bearing, his military posture despite the aggressive dog and shouting officer, caught Hayes's attention. Hayes had spent 30 years in the Army, rising from enlisted to officer ranks through 3 wars and countless peacekeeping missions. He'd learned to read people, to distinguish between genuine threats and misunderstandings, between criminals and soldiers. What he saw in Darius Jackson's stance was not the posture of someone planning trouble, it was the bearing of someone who had seen real trouble and survived it. "I haven't broken any laws," Darius said calmly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled authority that came from leading soldiers in combat. "I'm paying my respects to fallen comrades." His words were measured, respectful, but firm. In Afghanistan, he'd learned that de-escalation was often more effective than confrontation, that calm leadership could defuse situations that violence would only make worse. But he'd also learned that sometimes, no matter how reasonably you behaved, no matter how carefully you followed rules and procedures, the situation was beyond your control. "My dog's trained to detect threats," Reynolds replied, his own stress level rising as the crowd around them grew larger and more vocal. "He's alerting on you for a reason." Rex's behavior was indeed unusual, but not in the way Reynolds understood. The German Shepherd's early training at Lackland Air Force Base had included exposure to Medal of Honor recipients, part of a program designed to teach military working dogs to recognize and respect the highest levels of military honor. The distinctive scent of the medal's bronze and ribbon, combined with the pheromones associated with combat veterans, had triggered deeply ingrained recognition patterns in Rex's brain. But that recognition was fighting against his more recent training as a police dog, creating confusion and agitation that manifested as aggressive behavior. Rex was essentially at war with himself, his military programming conflicting with his law enforcement conditioning. "Sir, I need to see some identification, and I need you to step away from the memorial while I verify your information," Reynolds continued, his training taking over as he followed standard procedures for suspicious person encounters. The crowd continued to grow, drawn by the spectacle of a police confrontation at a revered public space. Rebecca Martinez, 45, a high school history teacher, had brought her 16-year-old son Miguel to the memorial as part of a lesson about veterans and sacrifice. They found themselves witnessing something that would become its own history lesson. "Mom, what's happening?" Miguel asked, his teenage awareness of social justice issues immediately activated by the sight of a black man being confronted by white police. "I don't know, mijo," Rebecca replied, pulling out her phone to record. "But we need to witness this." The gathering crowd included a diverse mix of Phoenix residents, veterans, students, families, tourists, local workers on their lunch breaks. What they had in common was a growing sense that they were witnessing something significant, something that would matter beyond the immediate moment. Sergeant Lisa Davis, Reynolds' supervisor, received the radio call about a disturbance at Veterans Memorial Park while she was completing paperwork at the district station. At 43, Davis had 15 years of experience with the Phoenix Police Department and had worked her way up from patrol officer to sergeant through a combination of solid police work and careful navigation of departmental politics. "Unit 23 responding to Veterans Memorial," she radioed back. "ETA 7 minutes. Davis had worked with Reynolds for 3 years and generally considered him a competent officer, but she'd noticed some concerning patterns in his arrest reports, a disproportionate number of confrontations with black suspects, a tendency to escalate situations rather than de-escalate them, and a defensive attitude when questioned about his methods. The ride to the memorial gave her time to consider the possibilities. Veterans Memorial Park was usually a peaceful place, a site for reflection and remembrance rather than criminal activity. If Reynolds was having problems there, it was likely either a misunderstanding or something more serious involving his judgment and decision-making. Back at the memorial, the tension was reaching a critical point. Rex's barking had attracted the attention of park security, nearby businesses, and even passing motorists who stopped to see what was happening. The scene was beginning to have the feeling of a significant event, the kind of confrontation that could define careers and change policies. Darius remained calm, but his mind was racing through tactical assessments and exit strategies. In Afghanistan, situations could change from peaceful to deadly in seconds, and survival often depended on reading subtle cues and preparing for multiple contingencies. The aggressive dog, the stressed officer, the growing crowd, all of these factors created a volatile mix that could explode without warning. "Officer," he said, his voice remaining steady despite the chaos around him, "I'm a veteran. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan. I come here every month to honor friends who didn't make it home." "I don't care if you're a veteran," Reynolds snapped, his frustration and embarrassment at losing control of the situation bleeding through his professional facade. "Military service doesn't give you special privileges to ignore police commands." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. The crowd, many of whom were veterans themselves or family members of veterans, reacted with audible gasps and angry murmurs. "Did he just say he doesn't care if the man's a veteran?" Rebecca Martinez asked her son, her voice rising with indignation. "At a veterans memorial?" Jake Morrison added, his Navy training making him instinctively protective of fellow service members. "What the hell is wrong with this cop?" Emily Carter's live stream, which she had started broadcasting on her news station's social media platform, was beginning to gain viewers as word spread through veteran networks and social justice organizations. Comments were flooding in faster than she could read them, but the sentiment was clear. outrage at what appeared to be police harassment of a veteran at a memorial dedicated to military service and sacrifice. Captain Hayes pushed through the crowd, his military bearing and obvious age giving him natural authority in the situation. He'd seen enough in his 30 years of service to recognize when a situation was spiraling out of control, and he'd learned that sometimes intervention by a respected third party could prevent tragic outcomes. "Officer," Hayes said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command that never fully leaves career military personnel, "what exactly is this gentleman being accused of?" Reynolds turned toward the new voice, immediately recognizing the military bearing and authoritative presence of the older man. "Sir, this doesn't concern you. Please step back and let me handle this situation." "Like hell it doesn't concern me," Hayes replied, his weathered face setting into hard lines. "This is a memorial for fallen soldiers, including my son. If you're harassing a veteran here, it absolutely concerns me." The revelation that Hayes had lost a son in military service added another layer of emotional intensity to an already charged situation. The crowd pressed closer, no longer just curious onlookers, but active participants in what was becoming a community confrontation with deeper implications. Rex's behavior suddenly shifted. The German Shepherd's aggressive barking stopped, replaced by a softer whining sound. His ears perked forward, and his nose worked frantically as he caught a scent that triggered different memories, different associations. Darius noticed the change immediately. His experience working with military dogs in Afghanistan had taught him to read canine body language, to understand the subtle differences between aggressive alert and recognition response. Rex was no longer indicating a threat. He was indicating something else entirely. "Easy, boy," Darius said softly, his voice taking on the calm, authoritative tone that military working dogs were trained to recognize and respect. "It's okay." The effect was immediate and noticeable. Rex's entire posture relaxed slightly, his tail beginning to wag tentatively as his confused brain tried to process conflicting signals. "What the hell?" Reynolds muttered, staring at his partner in bewilderment. In 18 months of working together, he'd never seen Rex respond to a suspect's voice with anything approaching friendliness. Dr. Foster pushed through the crowd, her medical training making her acutely aware of the stress levels and potential for violence in the developing situation. "Officer, that man is obviously not a threat. He's clearly a veteran showing respect at a memorial. Why are you escalating this?" "Ma'am, please step back and let me do my job," Reynolds replied, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. Rex's changed behavior was undermining his confidence in his initial assessment, but his pride and training prevented him from simply walking away. Christina Park, still recording the encounter, spoke loudly enough for her phone's microphone to pick up her words. "This is social worker Christina Park, documenting what appears to be racial profiling of a veteran at Veterans Memorial Park in Phoenix. The time is approximately 4:15 p.m. on September 15th. Her announcement that she was officially documenting the encounter for potential legal proceedings sent a ripple of tension through both the crowd and Officer Reynolds. The situation was moving beyond a simple police encounter into something with potential career and legal consequences. Emily Carter's live stream had reached over 5,000 viewers, with the number climbing rapidly as shares and notifications spread through social media networks. The hashtags Dr. Veterans Memorial and Dr. Phoenix Police were beginning to trend locally, drawing attention from activists, veteran organizations, and media outlets. This is Emily Carter reporting live from Veterans Memorial Park in Phoenix, where a police officer is confronting what appears to be a veteran at the memorial wall, she narrated to her growing audience. The situation is tense, with a police dog showing aggressive behavior toward a man who claims to be honoring fallen soldiers. The comments on her live stream were becoming increasingly heated. "This is racial profiling. Leave the vet alone. That cop should be fired. What's wrong with that dog? This is why people don't trust police." Sergeant Davis arrived on the scene to find a crowd of approximately 50 people surrounding her officer and a black man standing calmly near the memorial wall. Her experienced eye immediately assessed the situation: high tension, multiple recording devices, a vocal crowd expressing anger at police actions, and clear potential for the kind of incident that could generate negative headlines and internal investigations. "What's the situation here, Reynolds?" she asked quietly, approaching through the crowd with the kind of calm authority that came from years of managing difficult situations. "Sarge, my dog alerted on this individual. He was acting suspiciously near the memorial, and when I approached to investigate, he became uncooperative." Even as Reynolds spoke the words, he could hear how weak they sounded. The man was clearly not being uncooperative. He was standing calmly, speaking respectfully, and making no threatening moves. His only crime appeared to be visiting a public memorial while black. "Sir," Sergeant Davis addressed Darius directly, "could you tell me what brought you to the memorial today?" "Ma'am, I come here every month to pay my respects to soldiers from my unit who were killed in Afghanistan. Today marks 13 months since we lost them." Darius's voice remained steady, but those with military experience could hear the pain underlying his words. "You served in Afghanistan?" Davis asked. "3 tours, 82nd Airborne Division, Staff Sergeant Darius Jackson." Captain Hayes stepped forward again. "Sergeant, I'm Captain David Hayes, retired Army. My son Timothy was killed in Afghanistan 13 months ago. If this man served with my boy, I want to hear what he has to say." The mention of a specific casualty, with a grieving father present, added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. Davis realized she was dealing not just with a potential police misconduct issue, but with something that could have profound emotional and political ramifications for the department and the community. Rex chose that moment to sit down and whine softly, his confusion and internal conflict evident to anyone who understood dog behavior. The German Shepherd looked back and forth between his handler and Darius, as if seeking guidance on how to reconcile the conflicting messages he was receiving. "What's wrong with your dog, officer?" Captain Hayes asked, his sharp eyes noting the animal's distressed behavior. Reynolds didn't have an answer. Nothing in his training had prepared him for a police dog that seemed to be having an identity crisis in the middle of a confrontation. That's when Darius made the decision that would change everything. Slowly, carefully, making sure his movements were visible to everyone present, he reached up and pulled the Medal of Honor from beneath his shirt, letting it rest openly on his chest where Rex could see it clearly. The effect was immediate, profound, and unmistakable. Rex rose to his feet, took 3 deliberate steps forward, and assumed a position that everyone with military experience recognized immediately: the formal position of attention, with his head slightly bowed in what could only be described as a salute. The crowd fell silent. Even the traffic noise seemed to fade as "He remembers," Darius said softly, kneeling down carefully to scratch behind Rex's ears. Military working dogs are trained to recognize and respect military decorations, especially the Medal of Honor. This boy has seen it before. "Where did you get him?" Captain Hayes asked Officer Reynolds pointedly. Reynolds hesitated, suddenly understanding that his answer might be significant. He came from a military program. His previous handler was killed in Iraq. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with almost audible precision. Rex's confusion, his aggressive alerting followed by respectful salute, his obvious recognition of Darius, it all made sense in the context of a military working dog trying to reconcile his original training with his current role. "What was his handler's name?" Darius asked gently, still petting Rex. "Sergeant Maria Vasquez," Reynolds replied. "She was killed by an IED in Mosul in 2022. Darius closed his eyes for a moment, processing the information. "I knew Maria. We worked together during my second deployment. She was a good—" Rex seemed to sense the gravity of what was being shared, moving closer to Darius and sitting at attention beside him. "We had casualties, bad ones. Timothy Hayes, Captain Hayes' son, was hit by sniper fire. 3 other soldiers were wounded, and we were pinned down in a valley with Taliban fighters on the high ground. Command told us to hold position and wait for air support, but our wounded were dying. The crowd had grown silent, hanging on every word. Even the distant traffic seemed to quiet as Darius continued his account. The only way out was through a minefield that hadn't been fully cleared. Intelligence said it was mostly safe, but mostly safe isn't good enough when you're carrying wounded soldiers. Darius's voice carried the weight of command decisions made under impossible circumstances. "So you went anyway," Captain Hayes said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I went 12 times, Darius replied simply. 12 trips through that minefield, each time carrying out a wounded soldier. Timothy was conscious for most of it. He kept telling me to leave him, to save the others first. Rebecca Martinez had tears streaming down her face. Her son Miguel stood transfixed, his understanding of heroism being fundamentally redefined by what he was hearing. The Taliban were targeting the evacuation route. They could see what I was doing, and they concentrated their fire on anyone trying to reach the wounded. I took shrapnel from an RPG on the 8th trip, but there were still 4 soldiers out there. Rex whined softly, as if sensing the pain in Darius's voice. "I couldn't save them all," Darius continued, his voice breaking for the first time. "Timothy died in my arms on the 11th trip. He made me promise to tell his father that he wasn't afraid, that he was proud to serve." Captain Hayes stepped forward and embraced Darius, both men weeping openly. The crowd watched in respectful silence as a father and the man who had tried to save his son found a moment of shared grief and healing. "He wrote about you in his last letter home," Hayes said through his tears. "Called you the bravest man he'd ever known. Said you'd run into hell itself to bring a soldier home." "I brought 11 home," Darius replied. "It should have been 12. "Son," Hayes said firmly, "you brought my boy home too. You gave him dignity in death, and you gave our family closure. That's a gift beyond measure." The emotional weight of the story had transformed the entire gathering. What had begun as a confrontation about police conduct had become something deeper, a moment of recognition for sacrifice, a reminder of the true cost of military service, and a reckoning with how society treats its heroes. Emily Carter's live stream had reached over 40,000 viewers, with major news networks beginning to pick up the story. The comments were no longer focused on police misconduct, but on gratitude, respect, and awe at the courage being described. Officer Reynolds had been listening to every word, watching the respect and admiration on every face turned toward Darius. The contrast between how he had treated this man and how he deserved to be treated was stark and shameful. "Staff Sergeant Jackson," Reynolds said, stepping forward hesitantly, "I owe you an apology, a complete unreserved apology." The crowd turned to watch the officer who had initiated the confrontation. Some faces showed anger, others curiosity about whether he would take responsibility for his actions. "I made assumptions based on your race and appearance," Reynolds continued, his voice shaking. "I saw a black man in civilian clothes and assumed threat instead of recognizing a soldier honoring his fallen brothers. There's no excuse for that." Darius studied Reynolds's face, seeing genuine remorse and shame there. In Afghanistan, he had learned to read people quickly and accurately. Survival often depended on distinguishing between genuine intentions and deception. "Apology accepted," Darius said simply. "But accepting your apology doesn't mean we forget what happened here." "I don't want you to forget," Reynolds replied. "I want this to change how I do my job, how I see people, how I serve this community." Sergeant Davis approached the group. "This conversation needs to continue, but privately. We have procedures to follow, reports to file, and systemic issues to address." Dr. Foster stepped forward. "Before this crowd disperses, I think it's important that everyone understands what we've witnessed here. This isn't just about one police officer making a mistake. This is about how our society treats veterans, particularly veterans of color, and how we can do better." Christina Park nodded in agreement. This incident needs to be documented, studied, and used as a catalyst for change. We can't let it just disappear into bureaucratic processes. As if summoned by the growing significance of the event, more people continued to arrive. Word was spreading through social media, veteran networks, and local news reports. The memorial was becoming a gathering point for anyone who wanted to bear witness to what was happening. Among the new arrivals was Sergeant Major Robert Coleman, a formidable figure in his 50s who represented the local chapter of the Veterans of Foreign Wars. His presence commanded immediate respect from everyone present, veteran and civilian alike. "What's the situation here?" Coleman asked, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in the Army. Captain Hayes quickly briefed him on what had transpired, from the initial confrontation to the revelation of Darius's Medal of Honor to the ongoing discussion about police conduct and veteran treatment. Coleman listened without comment, his expression grave as he processed the information. When Hayes finished, Coleman approached Darius and came to attention, rendering a perfect military salute. "Staff Sergeant Jackson," he said formally, "on behalf of the veteran community, I want to express our pride in your service and our outrage at the treatment you received here today." Darius returned the salute, and the exchange created a moment of military protocol and honor that contrasted sharply with the earlier police confrontation. "Sergeant Major," Darius replied, "I appreciate the support, but I hope we can use this incident to build bridges rather than burn them." Coleman nodded approvingly. "That's the kind of leadership that earns you the Medal of Honor, but leadership also means holding people accountable and demanding better." He turned to face Sergeant Davis and Officer Reynolds. "This incident will be reported to every veteran organization in the state. We'll be monitoring how your department handles it, and we'll be evaluating your commitment to serving all members of this community with equal respect." The implicit threat was clear. The veteran community would be watching, and they would hold the Phoenix Police Department accountable for meaningful change. Emily Carter concluded her live broadcast with a summary that captured the complexity of what had unfolded. What began as a routine police patrol has become a profound lesson about assumptions, respect, and the hidden heroes among us. A Medal of Honor recipient was treated with suspicion for honoring fallen soldiers, and it took a former military working dog to remind everyone what true recognition looks like. As the formal crowd began to disperse, smaller groups formed around Darius, veterans who had heard about the incident and come to show support, active duty personnel from nearby military installations, family members of fallen soldiers whose names were etched on the memorial wall. Each group brought their own stories, their own connections to the sacrifice that Darius's medal represented. The memorial, which had been designed as a place for quiet reflection, was buzzing with conversation, connection, and community building. Miguel Martinez approached Darius with his notebook in hand. "Mr. Jackson, could I interview you for my school project? I'm writing about American heroes." Darius smiled, the first genuine smile he'd shown since the confrontation began. "What do you want to know? How do you know if you're brave enough to be a hero?" The question, profound in its innocence, caused Darius to pause and consider his response carefully. "You don't know," he said finally. "You just do what needs to be done, even when you're scared. Especially when you're scared." "Were you scared in Afghanistan?" "Every day. Fear keeps you alive, but you can't let it keep you from doing what's right." Miguel scribbled notes furiously, clearly inspired by the conversation. His mother Rebecca watched proudly, knowing that her son was receiving a life lesson that no textbook could provide. Rex had remained close to Darius throughout all the conversations, as if he had appointed himself as the veteran's guardian. The bond between them was immediate and deep, forged by shared understanding of service, sacrifice, and loss. Officer Reynolds had stepped back to give space for the conversations, but he continued to watch and listen. Every interaction, every story shared, every gesture of respect shown to Darius was a lesson in the kind of treatment he should have provided from the beginning. "Rex seems to have found a new friend," Sergeant Davis observed, noting how the dog remained close to Darius despite his handler being several feet away. Military working dogs never forget their first loyalty, explained Franklin Pierce, the Vietnam veteran who had worked with scout dogs. That dog recognizes something in Staff Sergeant Jackson that goes deeper than police training. As the afternoon wore on, the informal gathering took on the characteristics of a community event. Someone brought folding chairs from a nearby business. Others provided water and snacks. The confrontation that had begun with suspicion and hostility was transforming into something resembling a celebration of service and sacrifice. Dr. Foster had been observing the dynamics carefully, her medical and psychological training helping her understand the therapeutic value of what was occurring. "This is exactly what veterans need," she told Christina Park. "Community recognition, peer support, and validation of their service." "It's also what communities need," Christina replied. "The chance to meet their heroes, to understand the cost of freedom, and to take responsibility for how they treat those who've served." Captain Hayes had spent much of the afternoon in conversation with other parents who had lost children in military service. The memorial had become a place where grief could be shared, where stories could be told, and where the living could honor the dead through connection with each other. "This is what Timothy would have wanted," he told Darius during a quiet moment. "Not just his name on a wall, but a community that remembers and values service." "He'd be proud of how his father handled today," Darius replied, "standing up for what's right, demanding respect for veterans." As the sun began to set over Phoenix, casting long shadows across the memorial, the day's events were taking on historical significance. Social media posts about the incident were being shared thousands of times. News outlets were preparing follow-up stories. Veteran organizations were planning responses and policy recommendations. But for Darius, the most important outcome was simpler. He had been able to honor his fallen friends, he had been supported by his community, and he had potentially opened a path for positive change. "Staff Sergeant," Sergeant Major Coleman approached as the gathering began to wind down. "The VFW would like to invite you to speak at our next meeting. Share your story, help us figure out how to prevent incidents like this." "I'd be honored," Darius replied, "but I'd like Officer Reynolds to be there too. If he's serious about changing how he does his job, he needs to hear from veterans about their experiences." Coleman looked surprised but nodded approvingly. "That takes real character, including the man who wronged you in the solution." Rex had settled at Darius's feet, clearly reluctant to leave his side. The German Shepherd's behavior throughout the day had become symbolic of the recognition and respect that all veterans deserved but didn't always receive. Officer Reynolds approached hesitantly. "Staff Sergeant Jackson, I know I have a lot to learn and a lot to make up for. If you're willing to help me understand how to serve veterans better, I'd appreciate the opportunity." "First lesson," Darius replied, "is that we're not looking for special treatment. We just want the same respect and dignity that every citizen deserves." "I understand," Reynolds said, "and I want to make sure that every veteran who visits this memorial feels welcome and honored." As the crowd finally began to disperse, Emily Carter conducted final interviews with key participants. The consensus was clear. What had happened was unacceptable, but the response had been powerful and potentially transformative. "This is how change happens," one veteran told her camera. "Not through anger or violence, but through education, understanding, and community action." The memorial returned to its normal quiet as darkness settled over Phoenix. But the impact of the day's events would continue to ripple outward for weeks and months to come. Policy changes would be implemented. Training programs would be developed. And most importantly, a community had been reminded of the heroes living among them and the respect they deserved. Darius made one final visit to Timothy Hayes' name on the wall, Rex sitting quietly beside him. "Well, Tim," he said softly, "today was supposed to be a quiet visit. Turned out to be something else entirely. But I think you would have approved. Your dad stood up for what's right, just like you taught me to do." Rex whined softly and placed his paw on Darius's arm, a gesture of comfort and solidarity that transcended species and spoke to the universal bonds forged through service and sacrifice. The morning after the confrontation at Veterans Memorial Park, Phoenix awoke to a city transformed by social media virality and national news coverage. Emily Carter's live stream had been viewed over 200,000 times, shared across multiple platforms, and picked up by major news networks. The hashtag #JotYour Medal of Honor Veteran was trending nationally, and the story had sparked conversations about police conduct, veteran treatment, and racial profiling in communities across America. Phoenix Police Chief Maria Rodriguez arrived at headquarters at 5:30 a.m., 3 hours earlier than usual, to find her voicemail full of messages from reporters, veteran organizations, civil rights groups, and concerned citizens. Her secretary had left a stack of urgent memos on her desk, and her phone was ringing before she could even sit down. "Chief Rodriguez, this is Congressman Martinez's office calling about the incident at Veterans Memorial Park yesterday." "Chief, this is CNN. We'd like to schedule an interview about the confrontation with the Medal of Honor recipient." "Ma'am, this is the National Commander of the American Legion. We need to discuss the treatment of our veterans by your officers." Rodriguez had been police chief for 5 years, rising through the ranks during a career that had seen significant changes in law enforcement practices and community relations. She understood immediately that the Veterans Memorial incident had the potential to define her leadership and her department's reputation for years to come. Her first call was to Sergeant Lisa Davis, requesting a complete written report of the incident and a preliminary assessment of Officer Reynolds' conduct. Her second call was to the department's legal counsel, anticipating potential civil rights lawsuits and federal investigations. Her third call was to the mayor's office, knowing that political pressure would be intense and immediate. Meanwhile, at his apartment in a modest complex on Phoenix's south side, Darius Jackson was experiencing his own form of aftermath. His phone had been ringing constantly since he'd returned home the previous evening, with calls from reporters, veteran organizations, old military buddies who had seen. He had turned off his phone after midnight, but sleep had been elusive. The events at the memorial had triggered memories he'd been trying to process for months, not just of the battle that had earned him the Medal of Honor, but of countless other incidents where he'd been viewed with suspicion or treated. At Veterans Memorial Park, the morning brought an unexpected sight. Dozens of people arriving to pay their respects, many carrying flowers, flags, and signs, expressing support for Darius and honoring veteran service. The incident had transformed the memorial from a quiet place of reflection into a pilgrimage site for those wanting to show solidarity. Rex and Officer Reynolds arrived for their morning patrol to find the memorial buzzing with activity. The German Shepherd immediately became alert, not with the aggressive tension of the previous day, but with the kind of focused attention that suggested recognition and anticipation. "He's looking for Staff Sergeant Jackson," Reynolds realized, watching his partner's behavior. "He's bonded with him." Among the visitors was a group of Medal of Honor recipients from around the region, veterans who had made the journey to Phoenix to show support for one of their own. Their presence lent additional gravity to an already significant situation. Retired Army Colonel James Mitchell, who had earned his Medal of Honor in Vietnam, approached Officer Reynolds with the kind of military bearing that commanded immediate respect. "Officer, I understand you're the one who confronted Staff Sergeant Jackson yesterday," Mitchell said, his voice neutral but his eyes sharp with assessment. "Yes, sir," Reynolds replied, coming to an instinctive position of attention. "I want you to understand something," Mitchell continued. "That medal around Darius's neck represents the absolute pinnacle of military service. It's awarded only to those who display such extraordinary valor that their actions become legend. When you questioned his right to be at this memorial, you questioned the sacrifice of every service member whose name is carved in that stone." The weight of Mitchell's words settled on Reynolds like a physical burden. He was beginning to understand that his actions the previous day had implications far beyond a single encounter. They had touched on fundamental questions of respect, recognition, and national values. "Sir, I realize I was wrong. I'm committed to doing better, to learning how to serve all members of this community with the respect they deserve." Mitchell studied Reynolds for a long moment. That's a start. But commitment without action is just talk. What are you going to do differently? The question would prove prophetic, as Reynolds' actions in the days and weeks following would determine whether he became part of the problem or part of the solution. At 10 a.m., Darius arrived at the memorial for what had become an unplanned public appearance. Word of his visit had spread through social media, and a crowd of several hundred people had gathered to see him, thank him for his service, and show support for his treatment. Rex immediately approached Darius, tail wagging enthusiastically, clearly happy to see the veteran again. The reunion between the dog and the Medal of Honor recipient created a powerful visual that photographers and videographers captured from multiple angles. "Staff Sergeant Jackson," called out a reporter from the Arizona Republic, "how do you feel about the national attention this incident has generated?" Darius considered his response carefully, aware that his words would be scrutinized and shared widely. "I hope it leads to positive change," he said finally. "Not just for veterans, but for anyone who's been judged by their appearance rather than their character." The crowd applauded, and several veterans stepped forward to shake his hand and share their own stories of discrimination and misunderstanding. Officer Reynolds watched from a respectful distance, continuing his patrol while observing the community response to Darius's presence. He was beginning to understand that his role at the memorial had fundamentally changed. He was no longer just maintaining security, but serving as a guardian of dignity and respect for all visitors. Emily Carter arrived with her news crew to conduct follow-up interviews and document the ongoing response to the previous day's events. Her initial live stream had launched her career to new heights, but she was determined to use her platform responsibly to promote understanding and positive change. "Officer Reynolds," she called out, "would you be willing to speak with us about what you've learned from this experience?" Reynolds hesitated, knowing that anything he said would be broadcast nationally and scrutinized intensely, but he also understood that accountability required more than private apologies. It demanded public acknowledgement of wrongdoing and commitment to change. "Yesterday I made serious errors in judgment," he said to Emily's camera. "I let my biases influence my actions, and I treated a Medal of Honor recipient with suspicion instead of respect. I'm committed to learning from this mistake and ensuring it never happens again." The interview, while brief, demonstrated a level of accountability that was unfortunately rare in police misconduct cases. Reynolds's willingness to admit fault publicly and commit to change earned cautious praise from some observers, though others remained skeptical about whether meaningful reform would follow. Throughout the morning, the memorial continued to draw visitors from across the political and social spectrum. Conservative veterans who typically supported law enforcement found themselves criticizing police conduct. Liberal activists who usually focused on police reform found themselves celebrating military service. The incident had created unusual alliances and unexpected conversations. Sergeant Major Robert Coleman arrived with a delegation from the local VFW post, carrying a wreath to place at the memorial and a formal statement condemning the treatment Darius had received. "This incident represents everything that's wrong with how our society views veterans." His words resonated particularly strongly with veterans in the crowd, many of whom had experienced similar incidents of profiling or discrimination in civilian settings. Dr. Foster had set up an informal counseling station at the memorial, offering support to veterans who were triggered or traumatized by the previous day's events. Several former service members approached her, sharing stories. "Timothy would be proud," Captain Hayes said, joining Darius at his son's name on the memorial wall. "This is exactly the kind of legacy he would want, using a moment of injustice to create lasting positive change." Darius nodded, his hand moving instinctively to the Medal of Honor around his neck. The weight of the medal felt different now, still heavy with the memory of loss and sacrifice, but also carrying the potential for transformation and hope. Rex sat beside them both, a living bridge between military service and civilian community, between past sacrifice and future possibility. between the divisions that separate people and the bonds that unite them in common purpose and shared values. 2 weeks after the confrontation at Veterans Memorial Park, the Phoenix Police Department's training facility buzzed with an energy that Chief Rodriguez hadn't seen in her 5 years of leadership. Officers from across the department had gathered for the first session of what would become known as the Veterans Recognition and Respect Protocol, a comprehensive training program developed in direct response to the Medal of Honor incident. Officer Jake Reynolds stood at the front of the classroom, no longer just a patrol officer who had made a serious mistake, but a key architect of systemic change. Beside him sat Darius Jackson, whose presence commanded immediate respect from every officer in the room. Rex lay quietly at Darius's feet, having become an unofficial mascot for the new training program. 2 weeks ago, I was where many of you are now, Reynolds began, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of what he was sharing. I thought I was doing my job correctly. I thought my training had prepared me for every situation. I was wrong. The officers listened intently, many of them having seen the viral video of the memorial confrontation and understanding that their own careers and the department's reputation hung in the balance of how they responded to these new protocols. I want you to understand something that I didn't understand 2 weeks ago, Reynolds continued. When we approach a veteran with suspicion, when we treat military service as somehow suspicious or threatening, we're not just insulting an individual, we're attacking the very foundations of what we claim to protect and serve. Darius rose to address the group, the Medal of Honor visible around his neck, serving as a constant reminder of the sacrifice and courage that many officers had failed to recognize in their fellow citizens. I don't want anyone to think that veterans expect special treatment, Darius said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had been forged in combat leadership. We don't want to be above the law or immune from legitimate police attention. What we want is the same thing every citizen deserves, to be treated as innocent until proven guilty, to be approached with respect rather than suspicion, and to have our service to this country acknowledged rather than ignored. The training session continued for 4 hours, covering implicit bias recognition, veteran identification techniques, de-escalation strategies, and cultural competency around military service and sacrifice. It was unlike any police training most of the officers had ever experienced, deeply personal, emotionally challenging, and focused on building bridges rather than maintaining barriers. Sergeant Major Robert Coleman had been invited to share the veteran community's perspective on law enforcement interactions. His presence in full dress uniform, ribbons and decorations telling the story of 3 decades of military service created a powerful visual reminder of the men and women officers might encounter in their daily duties. Every veteran carries invisible wounds, Coleman explained. Combat trauma, survivor guilt, the challenge of readjusting to civilian life, these are burdens that don't show up on background checks or police databases. When you approach a veteran with understanding rather than suspicion, you're often dealing with someone who has already sacrificed more for this country than most people ever will. The training program was being closely monitored by law enforcement agencies across the country, many of whom were developing their own versions based on the Phoenix model. The Department of Justice had sent observers, and the FBI was considering implementing similar protocols at the federal level. Dr. Amanda Foster had been brought in to address the mental health aspects of veteran police interactions, drawing on her experience treating former service members dealing with PTSD, depression, and adjustment disorders. When a veteran with combat trauma is confronted aggressively by law enforcement, it can trigger flashbacks, panic attacks, or defensive responses that escalate situations unnecessarily, she explained. Understanding these dynamics can help officers distinguish between genuine threats and trauma responses. The officers asked thoughtful questions, many of them sharing their own military service or family connections to the armed forces. It was becoming clear that the Veterans Memorial incident had opened space for conversations that had been needed for years but had never been prioritized. Meanwhile, across town at Veterans Memorial Park, the daily routine had changed dramatically. What had once been a quiet place for reflection had become a pilgrimage site, with hundreds of visitors each day coming to pay their respects, learn about military service, and show support for veteran issues. Darius continued his monthly visits to honor Timothy Hayes and his other fallen comrades, but now those visits included interactions with other veterans, conversations with students and community members, and informal counseling sessions with former service members who had been inspired by his example. "You've become a symbol," Captain Hayes observed during one of their regular conversations at the memorial. "Not just of heroism in combat, but of dignity under pressure, grace in the face of injustice." "I never wanted to be a symbol," Darius replied. "I just wanted to honor my friends." "Sometimes we don't get to choose our role in history," Hayes said, "but we do get to choose how we fulfill it." The memorial had been enhanced with new educational displays about the Medal of Honor, military working dogs, and the ongoing challenges faced by veterans in civilian society. The exhibits were drawing school groups, tourist visitors, and community organizations interested in learning more about military service and sacrifice. Miguel Martinez had completed his school project, which had evolved from a simple report about American heroes into a comprehensive multimedia presentation about the complexities of military service, the challenges of veteran reintegration, and the power of community response to injustice. His project had won state-level recognition and earned him a scholarship opportunity to attend a summer program at West Point. "Mr. Jackson inspired me to think differently about what heroism means," Miguel told a reporter from the Arizona Republic. "It's not just about what you do in war, but how you handle yourself when people treat you unfairly, how you use difficult experiences to help other people." The teenager's perspective had resonated with educators across the state, leading to invitations for Darius to speak at schools, participate in curriculum development, and serve as a role model for young people grappling with questions of service, sacrifice, and social responsibility. Officer Reynolds had requested permanent assignment to the newly created Community Relations and Veteran Outreach Division, a role that allowed him to work directly with veteran organizations, conduct educational programs, and serve as a bridge between law enforcement and the military community. His transformation had been remarkable and genuine. Reynolds spent his off-duty hours studying military history, attending veteran support group meetings, and working with Rex to develop new protocols for police K-9 interactions with former service members. "Jake's become one of our most effective advocates," Sergeant Major Coleman told Chief Rodriguez during a monthly review meeting. "He brings a perspective that's unique, someone who made serious mistakes but was willing to learn and change. That credibility allows him to reach other officers who might be resistant to traditional diversity training." Rex had become central to the department's new approach to community policing. The German Shepherd's ability to recognize and respect military service had been incorporated into training protocols, and his story had become a powerful teaching tool about the importance of recognizing heroism in unexpected places. The dog's daily patrols of Veterans Memorial Park had evolved into educational opportunities, with Reynolds explaining Rex's military background and his special connection to veteran visitors. School groups particularly enjoyed meeting the dog who had saluted a hero, and his presence had helped normalize positive interactions between police and community members. Christina Park had documented the ongoing transformation for her research on police reform and community healing. Her case study of the Veterans Memorial incident was being used by law enforcement agencies, social work programs, and civil rights organizations as an example of how individual misconduct could be transformed into systemic positive change. What makes this situation unique is that everyone involved committed to growth rather than defensiveness, she explained to a conference of police chiefs from across the Southwest. The officer admitted fault and worked to change. The veteran chose grace over anger. The community demanded accountability while supporting rehabilitation, and the institution implemented meaningful reform rather than cosmetic adjustments. The Phoenix model was being studied and replicated in cities across the country. Police departments in Denver, Austin, San Antonio, and Charlotte had implemented their own versions of veterans recognition training, often inviting Darius and Reynolds to share their story and help develop local protocols. Emily Carter's career had been transformed by her coverage of the Veterans Memorial incident. The young reporter had been offered positions at national news networks, but she had chosen to stay in Phoenix, focusing her work on community-based solutions to social problems and the power of individual stories to create systemic change. Her follow-up reporting on the aftermath had earned multiple journalism awards, but more importantly, it had helped maintain public attention on the positive changes emerging from what could have been just another example. The story didn't end when the confrontation ended, she told a group of journalism students at Arizona State University. The real story was what happened next, how a community chose to transform a moment of injustice into an opportunity for lasting positive change. 6 months after the initial incident, Veterans Memorial Park hosted its first annual Recognition and Respect Day, a community festival celebrating military service while promoting understanding between law enforcement and civilian communities. The event drew thousands of attendees, including Medal of Honor recipients from across the region, law enforcement officers from multiple agencies, veteran families, community leaders, and citizens who wanted to show support for positive police-community relations. Darius served as the keynote speaker, addressing a crowd that included many of the people who had witnessed his initial confrontation with Officer Reynolds. His speech focused on the power of forgiveness, the importance of holding institutions accountable while supporting individual growth, and the ongoing responsibility of all citizens to create communities worthy of military sacrifice. 6 months ago, I came to this memorial to honor my fallen friends and found myself confronted by suspicion and hostility, he told the assembled crowd. Today, I stand before you as proof that even the most difficult situations can become opportunities for understanding, growth, and positive change. Rex sat beside the podium throughout Darius's speech, his presence serving as a living reminder of the recognition and respect that had transformed a confrontation into a catalyst for reform. Officer Reynolds also addressed the crowd, sharing his perspective on personal transformation and institutional change. His remarks were met with cautious but genuine applause, recognition that his journey from prejudice to advocacy had been authentic and meaningful. I can't undo the mistakes I made, Reynolds said, but I can commit to using those mistakes as lessons that help me serve this community better. Every veteran who visits this memorial deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, and it's my job to ensure that happens. The festival included educational booths staffed by veteran organizations, police community relations specialists, and military historians. Families could learn about military service, veterans could access resources and support services, and community members could engage in conversations about civic responsibility and mutual respect. Captain Hayes had been instrumental in organizing the event, drawing on his military leadership experience and his personal investment in ensuring that his son's death contributed to positive change rather than just adding another name to a memorial wall. Timothy always believed that military service was about building bridges, not walls, Hayes told the festival attendees. This event, this community response, this commitment to understanding, this is the kind of legacy he would want. The success of Recognition and Respect Day led to plans for similar events in other cities, with Phoenix serving as a model for how communities could address police misconduct through education, accountability, and positive engagement rather than just protest and punishment. Dr. Foster had established a new program at her clinic specifically focused on helping veterans navigate interactions with law enforcement, providing training in de-escalation techniques, legal rights awareness, and stress management strategies. The Veterans Memorial incident showed us that many problems arise from misunderstanding rather than malice. She explained to a gathering of medical professionals working with former service members. When we help veterans communicate effectively with law enforcement, and when we help officers understand veteran experiences, we prevent conflicts before they start. Her program had already assisted dozens of veterans who had experienced difficulties with police, and several other cities were developing similar initiatives based on her model. The legal implications of the Veterans Memorial incident had been resolved through a combination of departmental discipline, policy changes, and community service rather than litigation. Darius had chosen not to pursue civil rights lawsuits, instead focusing his energy on ensuring that positive changes would prevent similar incidents for other veterans. "I didn't want this to be about money or punishment," he explained to a reporter from Military Times. "I wanted it to be about learning and growing and making sure that other veterans wouldn't face what I faced." His decision to prioritize reform over retaliation had earned praise from veteran organizations, civil rights groups, and community leaders who recognized that lasting change required cooperation rather than just confrontation. The Phoenix Police Department's Veterans Recognition and Respect Protocol had become a national model, with requests for training materials and consultation coming from law enforcement agencies across the country. Chief Rodriguez had been invited to testify before Congress about best practices for police-veteran interactions, and the department had received federal grants to expand their community outreach programs. The Veterans Memorial incident could have been a disaster for our department and our community, Chief Rodriguez told a gathering of police chiefs at a national conference. Instead, it became an opportunity to examine our practices, acknowledge our failures, and implement meaningful changes that have improved our relationship with all community members. 1 year after the confrontation, Darius Jackson was invited to the White House to participate in a national conference on veteran affairs and community relations. His story had become part of a broader conversation about how America treats its service members and how individual acts of courage, both in combat and in civilian confrontations, could inspire systemic positive change. "Staff Sergeant Jackson represents the best of American values," the president said during the conference opening ceremony. "His service in Afghanistan saved lives and defended freedom. His response to injustice at home showed us how to transform conflict into understanding and individual mistakes into collective growth." The recognition was meaningful, but for Darius, the most important outcomes remained local and personal. Veterans visiting Phoenix felt more welcome at the memorial. Police officers were better trained to recognize and respect military service. The community had learned valuable lessons about the power of standing up for justice while still believing in the possibility of redemption and change. Rex had become a permanent fixture at Veterans Memorial Park, his daily presence serving as a reminder of the recognition and respect that all veterans deserved. The German Shepherd's story had been featured in military publications, police training materials, and educational curricula designed to teach young people about service, sacrifice, and social responsibility. "That dog changed everything," Franklin Pierce, the Vietnam veteran, often told visitors to the memorial. "He showed us what recognition looks like when it comes from the heart rather than just following rules or social expectations." Miguel Martinez, now a high school senior, had been accepted to West Point, his path influenced significantly by his encounter with Darius and his understanding of what military service truly meant. His essay about heroism, inspired by the Veterans Memorial incident, had been published in national magazines and used in schools across the country to teach students about courage, integrity, and civic responsibility. "Mr. Jackson taught me that being a hero isn't just about what you do in dramatic moments," Miguel wrote in his West Point application essay. "It's about how you handle everyday challenges, how you treat people who have made mistakes, and how you use your experiences to help other people grow and learn." The transformation of Veterans Memorial Park from a site of confrontation to a symbol of positive change had attracted visitors from across the country. Military families, law enforcement officials, community organizers, and students came to see the place where a police dog salute had reminded America of its values and responsibilities. Captain Hayes had become a regular speaker at the memorial, sharing his son's story and the lessons learned from the incident that had transformed his grief into purpose. His presence provided continuity and meaning for visitors who wanted to understand the deeper significance of what had occurred. This memorial was always about remembering sacrifice, Hayes told a group of visiting high school students. But the events of that September day taught us that remembrance without action is incomplete. We honor our fallen by ensuring that their sacrifice leads to a better, more just society. As the second anniversary of the Veterans Memorial incident approached, plans were underway for an expanded Recognition and Respect Day that would include participants from multiple states and representatives from federal agencies, veteran organizations, and law enforcement groups. The event had evolved into something larger than a local festival. It had become a national gathering focused on the ongoing work of bridge building between military and civilian communities, between law enforcement and the citizens they served, and between America's ideals and its actual practices. Darius continued his monthly visits to Timothy Hayes's name on the memorial wall, but now those visits included time spent with other veterans, conversations with community members, and informal mentoring of young people interested in military service or public service careers. Tim would be amazed by what grew out of that awful day, Darius told Captain Hayes during one of their regular conversations. He always believed that good could come from difficult situations if people were willing to do the hard work of understanding each other. Officer Reynolds had been promoted to lieutenant. Recognizing his Lieutenant Jake Reynolds, now 33, had become Chief of Community Relations for the Phoenix Police Department, a position created specifically to build bridges between law enforcement and the diverse communities they served. His transformation from the officer who had profiled a Medal of Honor recipient to a national advocate for police reform had been documented in academic studies, news features, and training materials used by law enforcement agencies worldwide. I speak to police departments across the country about bias recognition and community engagement, Reynolds told a reporter from CNN during the anniversary coverage. I always start with my story, how I almost destroyed my career and damaged my community by letting prejudice override judgment. It's a powerful lesson that resonates with officers who might be resistant to traditional sensitivity training. Rex had retired from
active police duty, but continued to live with both Darius and Reynolds, splitting his time between their homes and serving as an unofficial ambassador for veteran police relations. At 9 years old, the German Shepherd moved more slowly but still maintained the dignified bearing that had made him famous. His story had been featured in 3 documentary films, a children's book series, and countless news articles. But perhaps his most important legacy was the Rex Protocol, implemented by police departments nationwide, training requirements for K-9 units that included education about recognizing and respecting military service. Captain David Hayes, now 72, had become the unofficial historian of the Veterans Memorial incident and its aftermath. His monthly talks at the memorial drew visitors from around the world who wanted to understand how a moment of injustice had been transformed into a catalyst for positive change. People ask me if I ever could have imagined this outcome when I first saw my son's friend being confronted by that police officer, Hayes told a group of visiting military families. The truth is, none of us could have predicted the ripple effects. But that's the power of standing up for what's right. You never know how far the impact will spread. Miguel Martinez had graduated from West Point and was serving as a second lieutenant in the Army, his path directly influenced by his encounter with Darius at age 16.
His senior thesis at the military academy had focused on civilian-military relations and the importance of veteran advocacy in democratic societies. Mr. Jackson taught me that heroism isn't just about combat, it's about using your experiences to help other people and make your community better, Martinez wrote in a letter to Darius shortly before his graduation. I hope my military service honors the lessons he taught me about courage, integrity, and the power of forgiveness. The annual Recognition and Respect Day had grown into a 3-day festival that drew over 50,000 visitors to Phoenix each September. The event featured educational workshops, veteran job fairs, law enforcement training sessions, and community dialogue forums. It had become one of the most significant gatherings focused on military-civilian relations in the United States. Emily Carter had won multiple journalism awards for her coverage of the Veterans Memorial Incident and its aftermath, but she had chosen to remain in Phoenix, using her platform to continue highlighting stories of community transformation and social justice. Her book about the incident, The Salute: How a Dog's Recognition Changed America, had become a bestseller and was being adapted for film. The story resonated because it offered hope, Carter explained to a gathering of journalism students. In an era of deep divisions and cynicism about institutions, it showed that individual actions could still create meaningful change. People were hungry for proof that growth and redemption were still possible. Dr. Amanda Foster had expanded her veteran clinic into a regional medical center, providing comprehensive healthcare services to former service members throughout the Southwest. Her research on police-veteran interactions had influenced policy at the federal level, leading to new guidelines for law enforcement agencies receiving federal funding. The Veterans Memorial Incident opened conversations that had been needed for decades, Foster told a conference of medical professionals working with former service members. It forced us to examine how we treat veterans, not just in healthcare settings. Christina Park had completed her doctoral dissertation on the Veterans Memorial Incident, creating a comprehensive case study of how individual misconduct could be transformed into systemic positive change. Her work had been published in academic journals and was being used in social work programs, criminal justice courses, and public policy schools across the country. What made this situation unique was that every stakeholder committed to growth rather than defensiveness, Park explained to a gathering of community organizers. The officer admitted fault and worked to change. The veteran chose grace over anger. The community demanded accountability while supporting rehabilitation, and the institution implemented meaningful reform. It's a model for how we can address injustice constructively. Chief Maria Rodriguez had been elected to serve as president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, a position that allowed her to promote the Phoenix model of veteran-police relations on a global scale. The Phoenix Police Department had become a destination for law enforcement professionals seeking to understand best practices in community policing and bias reduction. The Veterans Memorial Incident could have destroyed our department's reputation and damaged police-community relations for years, Rodriguez told her fellow chiefs during her inaugural address. Instead, it became the catalyst for the most meaningful reforms in our department's history. We learned that accountability and growth are not opposites, they're partners in creating lasting positive change. The legal and policy implications of the incident had extended far beyond Phoenix. Congressional hearings on veteran treatment had led to new federal guidelines for law enforcement interactions with former service members. The Department of Veterans Affairs had implemented new programs focused on helping veterans navigate civilian institutions, including law enforcement encounters. 23 states had passed legislation requiring law enforcement training on veteran recognition and mental health awareness. The Darius Jackson Act, named in honor of the Medal of Honor recipient, provided federal funding for police departments implementing veteran-specific training programs. The educational impact had been equally significant. The Veterans Memorial Incident was featured in textbooks, curriculum guides, and online learning platforms used in schools across the country. Students were learning about courage, integrity, and civic responsibility through the lens of a confrontation that had been transformed into an opportunity for understanding. As the 5th anniversary approached, media outlets around the world were preparing retrospective coverage of the incident and its aftermath. The story had become an international symbol of how individual actions could create systemic change, inspiring similar initiatives in countries struggling with their own challenges related to veteran affairs and police-community relations. But for those most directly involved, the anniversary was not just about celebrating progress. It was about acknowledging ongoing challenges and renewing commitments to continued growth. "We've made significant progress, but the work isn't finished," Darius told the anniversary gathering. "Every veteran deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Every police officer deserves training that helps them serve all community members effectively. Every community deserves institutions that live up to their highest ideals." Officer Reynolds, speaking to the same gathering, emphasized the personal nature of lasting change. "Policies and procedures are important, but transformation happens one person at a time, one interaction at a time, one moment of recognition at a time. Each of us has the power to be the person who sees heroism where others see threat, who chooses understanding over assumption, who builds bridges instead of walls." Rex, now gray around the muzzle but still dignified in bearing, sat beside the podium throughout the anniversary ceremonies, his presence serving as a living reminder of the recognition and respect that had started everything. As the sun set over Veterans Memorial Park on the 5th anniversary of the confrontation that had changed so many lives, visitors from around the world stood in respectful silence before the bronze soldiers, the memorial wall, and the statue of a police dog in perpetual salute. The memorial had become what its designers had always intended, a place where the sacrifice of military service was honored and remembered. But it had also become something more, a symbol of the ongoing possibility for growth, redemption, and positive change in American society. The Medal of Honor around Darius Jackson's neck still carried the weight of 12 lives saved and 1 life lost in Afghanistan, but it now also carried the power of transformation, proof that individual courage, whether displayed on foreign battlefields or domestic confrontations, could still inspire communities to live up to their highest values and create lasting positive change. In the end, the story that began with a police dog's confused barking had evolved into a symphony of recognition, respect, and hope, a reminder that America's greatest strength lies not in its perfection, but in its capacity to learn from mistakes, grow from challenges, and emerge stronger and more united than before. The bronze soldiers continued their eternal vigil, but they were no longer alone in their watch. They had been joined by the living legacy of positive change, by the ongoing commitment of individuals and institutions to honor service, recognize sacrifice, and treat all citizens with the dignity they deserve. And every day, visitors to Veterans Memorial Park could see the statue of Rex in his salute position, a permanent